They say every photograph is a captured ghost, a sliver of a moment that can never be lived again. But what if some ghosts refuse to stay in the picture? My story tonight is about two people who were about to learn that some memories are not memories at all. They are warnings. First, let's meet Arthur Penn. To the world, he was a celebrated cartographer, a man whose hands had traced the edges of forgotten continents and mapped the depths of uncharted oceans. His apartment was a museum of the world. Sextants polished to a gleam, compasses that had guided him through unforgiving jungles, and maps, so many maps. But Arthur had a secret, a private obsession born from a tragedy years ago. His younger sister, Alani, had vanished from a national park he had mapped himself. No trace was ever found. Now, in the twilight of his career, he chases a different kind of unknown territory. He buys and restores old, discarded maps, obsessively searching their faded ink and brittle folds for places that shouldn't be there. Cartographical anomalies. Towns that exist for a year and then vanish from the record. Roads that lead to nowhere. He's looking for a pattern, a ghost on the atlas, a place that swallows people whole. He's looking for Alani. Then there is Dr. Alani Ismail. A linguistic anthropologist, Alani's expertise lies in dead languages. Languages that have no living native speakers. She's a codebreaker of the ancient world, able to resurrect the voices of long-dead civilizations from etchings on pottery and inscriptions on tombs. She's brilliant, respected, but also haunted. During a dig in the Peruvian Andes, her mentor, a man she revered, began speaking in a fluent, undocumented dialect moments before he suffered a complete psychological break. He was institutionalized, and the only thing he ever writes over and over is a single, elegant symbol she's never been able to identify. She believes the key to his madness, and perhaps his recovery, lies in deciphering that lost language. She has dedicated her life to finding another sample of it, a Rosetta Stone for a language that seems to exist only in the mind of a broken man. A reclusive mapmaker searching for a place that doesn't exist, and a brilliant linguist hunting for a language that should not be spoken. Two strangers, living worlds apart, whose lives were about to collide in the most terrifying way. The catalyst? A single, anonymous package delivered to each of them on the same rainy Tuesday. Inside Arthur's package was a rolled-up, hand-drawn map. It was old, drawn on vellum with an ink he didn't recognize. It depicted a small, isolated township nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place called Hollow's Echo, a town Arthur had never seen on any official map, modern or ancient. Alani's package contained a small, leather-bound diary. The pages were filled with elegant, handwritten script. To her astonishment, it was the very same language her mentor had spoken, the dialect that had shattered his mind. And as her eyes scanned the first page, she was able to translate a single, chilling phrase. The road to Hollow's Echo is not on any map. You do not find it. It finds you. Driven by their separate obsessions, they both followed the clues. Arthur used the strange map, whose landmarks seemed to shift and rearrange themselves on the page in the low light. Alani used the diary, which described a path guided not by sight, but by sound, by listening for a specific unnatural silence between the rustling of the leaves. They both found themselves on the same forgotten trail, a path that felt colder than the surrounding air, leading to a small, fog-shrouded town that greeted them not with welcoming lights, but with the unnerving stillness of a place holding its breath. They thought they were prepared for what they would find. Arthur, a town lost to time. Alani, the answers to a linguistic puzzle. They were both wrong. For as Arthur stood at the edge of the town square, he saw a weathered signpost, and carved into the wood was a single, elegant symbol he'd never seen before. And as Alani looked up at that same sign, her blood ran cold, for it was the exact same symbol her mentor had been scrawling for years. What terrible secret connected a lost town to a language that drove men mad? Why was the town completely silent, with food still on the tables and fires still smoldering in the hearths, yet utterly devoid of people? And perhaps the most terrifying question of all, if the road to Hollow's Echo finds you, does it ever let you leave? Chapter 1. The silence of Hollow's echo. The air in Hollow's echo was thick and heavy, like a wool blanket soaked in mist. A muffled sound, taste, and even thought. Arthur Penn felt it the moment he stepped past the crude, hand-carved sign bearing the town's name. The familiar noises of the forest, the chatter of squirrels, the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth, had simply stopped. It wasn't quiet. It was a profound and unnatural absence of sound, a vacuum that pressed in on his eardrums. He stood frozen, his hands still resting on the weathered signpost, tracing the strange, spiral-like symbol carved beneath the town's name. It was then that he saw her. A woman emerged from the fog on the opposite side of the path, her dark coat a stark silhouette against the swirling gray. She moved with a cautious, deliberate grace, her eyes wide as she scanned the desolate main street. She stopped dead when she saw him, her hand instinctively clutching a leather-bound book to her chest. For a moment, they just stared at each other, two lighthouses on a shore where the sea had vanished. "You're not from here," she said, her voice hushed, as if afraid to break the oppressive silence. It was Dr. Alani Ismail, and her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The symbol on the signpost was a brand on her mind, the same glyph that had been the final word from her mentor before his world collapsed into gibberish and terror. "Neither are you," Arthur replied, his voice a low rumble. He was a man of logic, of longitude and latitude, of things that could be measured and proven. But the map in his satchel felt unervingly warm to the touch, and the town laid out before him defied every rule of cartography he had ever known. "I followed a map. And I followed a diary," Alani said, taking a hesitant step forward. "It talks about this place. It says the people here vanished. Not left. Vanished." Together, they walked into the heart of Hollow's echo. The town was a perfectly preserved corpse. In the center of the square, a fountain stood silent, its basin filled with stagnant, leaf-choked water. A child's tricycle lay on its side, one wheel still spinning lazily in a breeze that neither of them could feel. The door to the general store was ajar, revealing shelves fully stocked with cans and jars, a fine layer of dust coating everything like a funeral shroud. It looked as though the inhabitants had simply evaporated in the middle of a mundane afternoon. Arthur's practical mind raced, searching for an explanation. A plague? A sudden evacuation? But there were no signs of struggle, no packed bags, no warnings scrawled on the walls. There was only this crushing stillness. He pulled a compass from his pocket, his last anchor to a world that made sense. The needle spun wildly, a frantic, silent dance. Alani, however, was attuned to a different kind of detail. Her gaze was fixed on the inscriptions. The same elegant, flowing script from her diary was everywhere. Etched into the fountain's stone rim, carved above the doorway of what looked like a town hall, painted delicately on the window of a small diner. It was a language that, according to academia, had no right to exist in this part of the world, on this continent, in this century. She felt a chilling premonition creep up her spine. This wasn't just a town. It was an archive. "The diner," Arthur said, pointing to a small building with a faded sign that read, "The Copper Spoon." "There's a light on." It was faint, but unmistakable. A single, bare bulb glowed from within, a lonely star in the deepening gloom. Pushing the door open, they were met not with the smell of old coffee or stale grease, but with the faint, sweet scent of cinnamon and something else, something metallic and cloying just beneath it. The scene inside was frozen in time. Plates of half-eaten food sat on the tables, coffee cups still half full. A newspaper from 1978 lay open on the counter. But it was what was behind the counter that made them both stop, the air catching in their throats. Pinned to the wall, amidst faded photographs of smiling townsfolk, was a large, meticulously detailed map of the surrounding national park. It was Arthur's map, one of his earliest, most celebrated works. He'd recognize his own drafting lines anywhere. But this copy was different. Dozens of small, red pins were stuck into it, clustered around one specific remote area. The area where his sister, Ilara, had disappeared all those years ago. Alani didn't see the map. Her attention was drawn to the newspaper lying on the counter. It was open to a photograph of a smiling young girl holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Alani felt a wave of vertigo, a dizzying sense of impossibility. It was a picture of her. A picture taken when she was 7 years old, a week before she and her family had emigrated from their home country, thousands of miles away. A picture that was supposed to be sitting in a shoebox in her mother's attic. And beneath the photograph, a caption, written in that beautiful, terrifying script from the diary. As Alani's mind struggled to make sense of the impossible, Arthur took a step closer to his defaced map. He reached out a trembling hand and pulled one of the red pins from the paper. Tucked behind it, almost completely hidden, was a tiny, folded piece of vellum. He carefully unfolded it. It wasn't a note. It wasn't a warning. It was a photograph, faded and worn. It showed a group of people standing in the town square, right outside this very diner. And in the center of the group, smiling as if she didn't have a care in the world, was his sister, Ilara. She was wearing a dress he had never seen, and standing next to her, with his arm around a young woman, was a face Alani knew all too well. It was her mentor, looking happy, healthy, and decades younger than the last time she'd seen him. How could Ilara, who vanished in 1995, be in a photograph from a town that seemed to die in 1978? And what was the connection between a lost cartographer's sister and a brilliant linguist who had succumbed to a language that shouldn't exist? They had come to Hollow's Echo looking for answers to their own private mysteries. But they were about to discover that this town wasn't an answer. It was a trap. And its silence was beginning to speak. For a long moment, the world in the Copper Spoon Diner tilted on its axis. Time itself seemed to fray at the edges. A photograph should be a fixed point, a captured instant, but the one Arthur held was a temporal impossibility. It was a contradiction made of paper and silver nitrate, and it felt heavier than a tombstone in his hand. "That's Ilara," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. He ran a thumb over his sister's smiling face, a face he hadn't seen outside of dreams in decades. She disappeared in 1995. This diner, this whole town, it feels like it's been dead since the 70s. Alani leaned in closer, her own shock a cold mask. "And that," she said, her voice trembling as she pointed to the man standing next to Ilara, "is Dr. Finch, my mentor. That photograph must have been taken before I was even born. But he didn't start his research in this region until the late 2000s. She then pointed to the newspaper on the counter, at the picture of the little girl. "And that is me. In a newspaper from 1978. The year before my family left our home country on the other side of the world. Their two separate, obsessive quests had led them to the same impossible junction. This wasn't just a lost town. It was a place where lost things, and lost people, seemed to wash ashore, untethered from the river of time. The map and the diary hadn't been clues. They had been summonses. Hollow's Echo hadn't just found them. It had been waiting for them. Chapter 2. The Ink of Impossible Years. They left the diner, stepping back into the suffocating silence of the town square. The fog had grown thicker, coiling around the silent buildings like a shroud. The world outside of Hollow's Echo felt like a distant rumor. Before, the silence had felt empty. Now it felt watchful. "The script," Alani said, looking around at the carvings on the fountain and the signs. "The diary calls the language anchor script. Says it's the language of memory. That things written in it become permanent." She looked towards the largest building on the square, a two-story wooden structure with a small, tarnished bell on its roof. The carving above the door was larger, more ornate. "The town hall. If there are records, they'll be in there." The heavy oak doors of the town hall swung open with a low groan, revealing a cavern of dust and shadows. A grand, sweeping staircase led to a dark upper floor, but it was the main hall that drew them in. It was a public records office, lined with shelves of thick, leather-bound ledgers. Arthur, a man who loved the tangible history of paper and ink, felt a cold dread. Nothing here felt right. He pulled a heavy volume from a shelf. It was a census record. He flipped it open, and the breath hitched in his chest. The entries were not chronological. A family from 1886 was listed just above a family from 1954, who lived next door to a family from 1998. The ink was different, the handwriting styles were from different eras, but they all sat on the same page, as if time were a collage. Arthur. Alani's voice was barely a whisper. She was pointing at a page in another ledger, this one titled Arrivals. It was a list of names and dates. He moved to her side and read the entry she was pointing to. Penn, Alara. October 12, 1995. The exact date she had vanished from the national park. His blood ran cold. It wasn't a record of a birth or a property purchase. It was the date the town had acquired her. Alani's finger traced down the page, past names from forgotten decades, until it landed on a much newer entry. The ink was still dark, as if it had only just dried. Ismail, Alani. November 3, 2025. Today's date. The book slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the floor with a heavy, dead thud. The town knew her name. The town knew she was here. This wasn't a historical record. It was a trap, and they had just read the inscription on the inside of the lid. And just as that horrifying realization settled, a sound shattered the profound, unnatural silence of Hollow's echo. The sound was shockingly loud, pure, and close. It came from outside, from a place that should have been inanimate. Both of them spun around, their eyes wide with terror. The sound had come from the old, dilapidated schoolhouse at the far end of the main street, a place they hadn't even truly noticed until now. A building whose bell should not have been able to ring. Slowly, as if compelled by a force they couldn't resist, they walked out of the town hall and stared down the fog-shrouded street towards the dark silhouette of the school. The rope for the bell hung limp and still on the outside of the belfry. There was no wind. No one was there. They took a step forward, then another, their feet crunching softly on the gravel path. The schoolhouse seemed to watch them approach, its windows like hollow, vacant eyes. As they drew within 20 feet of the front porch, another sound cut through the air, a sound far more intimate and terrifying than the bell. The small, weathered front door of the school, which had been firmly shut just a moment before, was slowly, deliberately creaking open. It was an invitation into the darkness, from a place where the children were long, long gone. Or were they? An open door can be a promise or a threat, an invitation into the light or a gateway into darkness. The door to the Hollow's Echo Schoolhouse was both. It stood ajar, a black slash in the gray fog, and Arthur and Alani knew with a primal certainty that to step through it was to cross a line from which there would be no retreat. But the town already had their names in its ledgers. Retreat was an illusion. Arthur was driven by the ghost of a girl in a faded photograph. Alani, by the ghost of a language that shattered minds. With a shared, grim nod, they left the world of the living and stepped into the classroom of the lost. Chapter 3. The Lesson on the Chalkboard. The air inside the one-room schoolhouse was cold and still, thick with the scent of chalk dust, decaying paper, and something else. A faint electric tang, like the air after a lightning strike. Rows of small, wooden desks, scarred with the board carvings of generations of children, faced a large, slate chalkboard. Everything was coated in a fine, gray dust, yet it was a strangely orderly scene. Books were stacked neatly. A single apple, petrified and dark, sat on the teacher's desk. It was another diorama of a moment that had ended abruptly. But unlike the diner or the town hall, this room felt occupied. An unseen energy prickled at their skin. Faint, indistinct whispers seemed to hang at the very edge of hearing, like the memory of a crowded room. Alani's gaze was fixed on the chalkboard. Written across the expanse of black slate, in the elegant, flowing lines of the anchor script, was a single perfect sentence. Her breath misted in the cold air as she translated it aloud. It says, "The lesson is simple. You cannot lose what you cannot remember." The words hung between them, a chilling statement of purpose. This wasn't a place of death. It was a place of erasure. Arthur moved slowly between the desks, his fingers brushing over the carved initials. A heart with JB plus Lottie 1902. A crudely etched rocket ship dated 1968. He was walking through a graveyard of stolen childhoods. Then he stopped. One desk near the front was smaller than the rest, and carved into the worn wood was a lopsided drawing of a star with a smiley face in it. His heart seized in his chest. It was a stupid little doodle he had taught Alara when she was 6, their secret symbol. His hand trembled as he reached for the hinged lid of the desk and lifted it. It wasn't empty. Lying inside, stark against the dark wood, was a single spiral-bound notebook. The cover was damp and warped, but the handwriting on the first page was achingly, horribly familiar. It was Alara's. "Alani," he breathed, and she was at his side in an instant. As they huddled together, the whispers in the room seemed to grow in volume, coalescing from a formless murmur into distinct, fragmented sounds. A child's giggle from a century ago, a snippet of a nursery rhyme sung in a language that hadn't been spoken since the 1800s, a boy crying for his mother in 1942. They were the ghosts of stolen moments, the echoes trapped within these walls. Arthur held the notebook while Alani, her finger tracing the words, began to read Alara's frantic scrawl aloud. "I didn't fall. I didn't get lost. I walked off the path and I was just here. The town is a library. That's what he told me. Dr. Finch. He was here too. He said the town collects stories. It takes people whose memories are strong and it keeps them. We are the books. We're not dead, but we're not alive. We're just read. Over and over." Alani paused, her blood turning to ice. He was here too. Finch had been trapped here, just like Alara. The photograph wasn't an impossibility. It was a record of 2 prisoners. She read on, her voice shaking. Finch thought he could escape. He thought he could find a way out by teaching the town a new story, a new language, something it had never heard before. He called it a virus of words. But he was wrong. The town, the silence, it doesn't want to learn. It just wants to listen. It listened to him until his mind was empty. And now, Alani stopped. The final sentence on the page was different. The handwriting was the same, but the ink was impossibly dark, as if it had been written only moments ago. She read it in a choked whisper. "And now it knows you're here, Dr. Ismail. It wants the language you've been chasing, the one that was locked inside his head." The moment her name left her lips, every whisper in the room ceased. The silence that rushed back in was absolute, a physical pressure that made their ears ring. It was the crushing, profound silence of a predator that has stopped stalking its prey and is now simply watching. They both looked up, their hearts frozen in their chests. At the large chalkboard, a piece of chalk was hovering in midair, held by nothing they could see. As they watched in pure, unadulterated terror, it began to move, scratching out a new message beneath the first one, the sound echoing like cracking bone in the horrifying stillness of the classroom. Terror has a sound. It is not always a scream. Sometimes, it is the deliberate, patient scrape of chalk on slate, writing a question in a room where no living hand holds it. For Arthur and Alani, frozen in the dusty air of the schoolhouse, that sound was the turning of a key in a lock that would seal their world shut. The entity in the room, the hungry silence of Hollow's echo, was no longer just watching. It was asking a question, and it expected an answer. Chapter 4. The Question in the Dust. The chalk wrote with a horrifying, elegant precision, the script a perfect match for the diary in Alani's bag. As the last curve was completed, the chalk dust settled, and the question hung in the air, a glowing indictment in the gloom. Where is the key? The chalk did not fall, simply vanished. But the words remained, a stark white wound on the darkness of the slate. "The key," Alani whispered, her own breath stolen from her. The diary mentioned it. The anchor script is a lock, but every lock has its key. Finch was looking for it. He thought it was a A phrase, a sound that could unravel the town. She looked at Arthur, her eyes wide with a terrible new understanding. It doesn't just want the language I know. It wants the part one don't. It thinks I have it. The moment she spoke, the atmosphere in the schoolhouse shifted. The silence broke, not with a bell, but with 1,000 furious whispers erupting from the very walls. The air grew heavy, crackling with a malevolent energy. The small, wooden desks began to tremble, a low, percussive drumming that vibrated through the floorboards and up their spines. Books, thick with the dust of forgotten decades, hurled themselves from the shelves, pages fluttering like panicked birds. "We have to go. Now!" Arthur yelled, grabbing Alani's arm. He was a man of maps, of clear lines and fixed points, and this place was a vortex of chaos. His instinct, honed by years of navigating treacherous terrain, screamed at him. This was not a place to analyze. This was a place to survive. They stumbled back out into the main street, the cacophony of the schoolhouse cutting off abruptly as the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening boom. The town was once again silent. But the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was charged, alert. The fog felt thicker, more disorienting, its tendrils seeming to coil and writhe in the corners of their vision. They had disturbed the archive, and now the librarian was angry. "It knows we're here. It knows what we're looking for," Arthur said, his voice low and urgent as he scanned the street. "And it knows what it's looking for. Alara's notebook. It said Finch tried to fight it." "He did," Alani affirmed, her mind racing, connecting the disparate, terrifying threads. "He tried to introduce a virus of words. A story the town couldn't digest. A language it couldn't absorb. He failed, but his research, his notes. If he was a prisoner here, he must have had a place he worked. A home." Their eyes simultaneously scanned the small, identical houses that lined the street. But one stood apart. At the end of a short, overgrown lane, partially hidden by skeletal trees, was a slightly larger house. A single dormer window stared out from its attic like a judgmental eye. It had the distinct air of a scholar's residence, a place of quiet contemplation that had soured into dereliction. "There," Arthur pointed. "If Dr. Finch lived in Hollow's Echo, he lived there." Driven by a desperate, newfound purpose, they started towards it. They weren't just running away from the schoolhouse anymore. They were running to something. An answer. A weapon. A hope. As they drew closer, pushing through grasping, thorny bushes that snagged at their clothes, a new sound began to bleed through the oppressive silence. It was faint at first, so faint they thought they were imagining it. But as they reached the rotting front porch of the house, it became unmistakable. It was the sound of a record player. The melody was slow, sorrowful, and impossibly, achingly familiar. Arthur stopped dead, his face paling, every ounce of blood draining from it. "No," he whispered, a look of pure disbelief on his face. "That's not possible." "What is it?" Alani asked, her hand on his arm. "That song," he said, his voice cracking. "My mother used to play it on the piano for Alara every single night before she went to sleep." From inside the dark, dead house of a man who should have been gone for decades, the impossible lullaby of a lost little girl was playing. And from the attic window, the one that looked like an eye, a single warm yellow light began to glow. There is no ghost more powerful than a beloved melody. It is a key that unlocks rooms in the heart that have been sealed for decades. For Arthur, the lullaby drifting from the derelict house was not just a song. It was the distilled essence of his grief, the purest memory of his loss. The glowing attic window was not a light. It was a beacon lit from the bonfire of his own past. He knew it was a trap. The town was baiting a hook with the last pure thing he had left. And like any man who has spent a lifetime searching, he had no choice but to swim towards it. The final, terrible chapter of their story was waiting for them at the top of a flight of stairs, in a room where a dead man's song was playing. Chapter 5, The Final Word. They pushed open the door to Dr. Finch's house, and the smell of old paper and ozone washed over them. The inside was a maelstrom of obsessive research. Books lay splayed open, their spines broken. Maps were tacked to every wall, covered in frantic red string and annotations in the anchor script. It was the nest of a man who had tried to map his own prison. The piano music was louder now, seeming to come from the very air around them, a psychic resonance that made their teeth ache. At the back of the hall, a narrow staircase led up into the darkness, towards the glowing light. Each step they took up the creaking stairs felt like a descent. When they reached the attic door, the music stopped abruptly. The yellow light still spilled from the cracks around the frame. Arthur reached out, his hand steady for the first time since entering the town, and pushed the door open. The attic was not a room. It was a wound. In the center, a record player spun, its needle clicking uselessly against the label. The light came from a single, bare bulb hanging from a wire, swinging gently as if pushed by an unseen hand. The walls were a dizzying collage of Finch's final theories, equations, linguistic trees, and 100 desperate renderings of the spiral symbol. And in the very center of the room, where the light was brightest, the air shimmered. It was a distortion, a heat haze in the cold air that was slowly coalescing. Within it, faint and translucent, were faces. A child from the 19th century. A soldier from the 1940s. Dr. Finch, his face a mask of placid confusion. And Alara. She was exactly as Arthur remembered, smiling, her hand held out. "It's the archive," Alani breathed, her voice filled with awe and terror. "The core. Is showing us what it has. Is showing us what it wants." Her eyes darted away from the apparition to the floor. Scratched frantically into the grimy floorboards around the shimmering light was Finch's last, desperate discovery. It wasn't a complex theory, but a simple, devastating conclusion. Alani read it aloud, her voice trembling. "It only knows how to save. It cannot delete, cannot end. The story is a loop. A new word is not the key. The key is a blank page. A blank page, the concept of an ending, of closure, of letting go." The town, the silence, was a perfect, immortal library of memory. It had no word for goodbye. The shimmering form in the center of the room seemed to sense their revelation. It solidified, the other faces fading until only Alara remained. A perfect, heartbreaking reconstruction built from Arthur's own grief. The apparition took a step forward, its voice a perfect echo of his sister's. "I waited for you, Artie. I'm not lost anymore. Stay with me. Stay and remember." It was the ultimate temptation. A lifetime of pain and searching, ended. All he had to do was step into the light and remember her forever. Arthur looked at the ghost of his sister, and the years of grief, of mapping the world just to find the one part he'd lost, washed over him. Tears streamed down his face. But as he looked at her perfect, smiling face, a face that could never age or change, he finally understood. To stay was not to save her. It was to be another book on the shelf. He took a shaky breath and looked past the phantom Alara, at the shimmering energy that held her image. "The lesson on the chalkboard," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "You cannot lose what you cannot remember." He then turned his gaze fully on the image of his sister. "I will always remember you, Alara. But I can't stay in this memory with you. It's time to turn the page." He took another step, and Alani tensed, thinking he was going to succumb. But he stopped, and said the simplest, most powerful words he had left. The words the town could not comprehend. "Goodbye, Alara. I love you. Rest now." The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The apparition of Alara screamed, but her face was no longer hers, contorting into a mask of pure static. The shimmering light exploded outwards, a shockwave of pure energy. The very concept of letting go was a paradox, a virus that the archive could not compute. It was trying to save a memory of being forgotten, and the contradiction was tearing it apart. The house began to disintegrate around them. The floorboards groaned, the walls cracked. The ghostly faces of 100 trapped souls flickered in the air, not in terror, but in a final, peaceful release, fading like smoke. "Arthur, come on!" Alani screamed, pulling him towards the stairs. They scrambled down, the house collapsing behind them. They burst out into the fog. But the fog was different now. It was thin, listless, the oppressive silence shattered by the sound of splintering wood and the rushing of wind. The natural sounds of the world were flooding back in. They ran, not looking back, down the main street, past the silent diner, past the dark town hall.
Subscribe to the channel and help us rediscover the light that was stolen from the sky.